I wanted to start with this question of why I started blogging in 2007. I went back and I looked at the archives, uh, uh, and it's actually it's because of my philosophy about development. You know, I'm a development economist. I do research on development problems, and I like to think that I try to use that research to bring about change, to actually improve the lives of poor people. And most of my research and most of our work in general involves trying to influence policy from your research. So, for instance, you do some research on the incidence of energy subsidies in a country, and you find that most of the energy subsidies are going to the richest 20% of the population. That's useful information in order to inform policymakers that maybe they should cut those energy subsidies and replace them with targeted cash transfers. This is something I'm currently doing in a couple of countries. But the problem is that we found over the years that you can talk to every politician and every policymaker you come into contact with and tell them this, and they understand it, but they still don't reform the energy subsidies, time and time again. And the reason is that they don't really care what you think as a researcher. What they really care about is what their voters think. They are concerned about the domestic politics in their country, and this applies to democracies as well as autocracies. Everybody in those positions are sensitive to what the group of people who give them any kind of legitimacy think. And so my decision was then to say, okay, if that's the case, then let me try to inform the public about our research. Rather than just writing and publishing papers that are read by a handful of PhDs in the country, let's get this information out to the man and woman in the street or in the village in some form or the other, because it's important that they know this. They have this information, say, on who benefits from energy subsidies. And that's how I started blogging, which was to actually disseminate information to an audience that we don't normally reach, which are sort of non-specialists in the field, ordinary citizens and ordinary people. And the important thing is that I blog not because it's an additional thing to do, or it's a nice thing to do, or I want the glory of additional publications. It's because it's part of my job. I insisted that this is, when I was chief economist in various regions at the World Bank, I'm there as chief economist. I'm trying to improve the quality of economic policies in these regions. To do so, I need to get this information to the public, and that's why I do my job. Now, this is important for another reason, because at the World Bank, blogging was considered part of the external communications department's responsibility, and they actually wanted to screen my blog posts and verify them and then send them out, and I refused. Because it's not their job. This is my job. I want to get this. I want to influence policy this way by informing the public with information, and that's why I'm going to do it. So and it also compromises my independence. Now, associated with that is a second reason why I started blogging and continue to do so, is that in development, as you probably know, there is no one answer. There's a multiplicity of answers. There are a multiplicity of ways of looking at energy subsidies that are quite different. And it's very important that the public is informed about this multiplicity of views. Their different voices should be heard. And so I used my blog not just to present my views on a subject or the results of my analysis, but that of other people, many of whom disagree with me. And this also raised some eyebrows at the World Bank, because even the president of the World Bank sort of said, how can Shanta speak on behalf of the World Bank? And don't we have a World Bank position? And how can I be sure that he's presenting the World Bank position? And the truth is, there is no World Bank position. They might think it is, but there are multiplicity of views. We had lots of disagreements within the World Bank on some of these issues as well. And again, I think what's important is that the public hear those different views. That is, it's very dangerous for an institution like the World Bank, or even a university like Georgetown, to come out and say, here's the one answer to this question. Now that actually, I'll tell you one anecdote, because when I started blogging, and I was the first blogger at the World Bank, the then president actually raised some concerns about, how should we be sure that Shanta is talking about giving the position of the World Bank. And then an incident happened within a few weeks of my starting, which is a guy named Devesh Kapoor, a professor at Johns Hopkins, published a article quite critical of the World Bank. And he's a friend of mine. And so what I did was I reprinted his article, actually linked it on my blog, and then I wrote my response, my view of what he had to say. And then when somebody told the president of the World Bank, this guy named Devesh Kapoor has written this critique, and the president said, how are we responding to it? And somebody told him, well, Shanta has already posted a response on his blog. And then he got it. He said, yes, that's exactly right. That's how we should be responding to these things, not as official World Bank response to this critique, but people in the World Bank have different opinions on these things, and they can exchange views, including agreeing with the critics from time to time. So those are the two big reasons why I blog. One is to inform the public, and the other is to present the public with multiplicities of views. Blogging is in many ways, and it's an evolving art, but in many ways it's very different from everything else we're trained to do. And the key there is that you're blogging in order to engage with your audience. That's the purpose of it, in which case your blog should be written and conducted in such a way that it encourages that engagement. So for instance, I mean, I have lots of people who I invite sometimes to guest blog on my blog. And occasionally, not less so now, but in the old days, they thought, oh, that I just send you the abstract of my working paper. That's the blog post, and that's exactly the wrong thing to do. When you write an abstract of a working paper, you're not trying to engage with your audience. So I think you have to just forget about all the things you've been taught about writing research papers and so on, and really ask the question, how can I take this idea? The idea is the same as the idea in the research paper, but how can I turn it into something that engages my audience? And usually the way I think about it is, it's more like what I would say if I were having a conversation with someone. If I were with you in Quito, and I would be sitting in the hallway over coffee, and you ask me, what are you working on? What would I say in that context? And that's pretty close to the way I would write a blog. And it's frequently useful to have a couple of enticing items in the beginning, like a provocative title, and an anecdote on an illustration to start with. When I was looking back, there were some of the titles I used. I mean, I was writing something about demography in Africa, and the demographic dividend and so on. The title is Are African Women Having Too Many Babies? And that, all of a sudden, I got lots of people saying, "Oh yeah, I read your blog." People who had no interest in demography either. But when you have a title like that, I had a lot of African women writing to me, actually, giving me their views on that on the blog post as well. The other is you don't start a blog post off like an abstract where you say, this paper is about X, Y, and Z. You start with an anecdote or an illustration. I think one of the ones that I'm very fond of is a blog post about public spending in health. That I told the whole blog. I made all three of my points with a joke. Each one starts with a joke. And that joke captures the point graphically, and then I illustrated it. I remember somebody's telling me, I disagree with everything in your blog, but I really like the jokes. So you can actually get people to read. Then the other thing is when you write a blog post, because the way I've been describing it so far is usually when you've done some analysis and you've written something that then you want to disseminate more widely and get more engagement with the general public. But it doesn't have to be that way. It could be also when you have an idea that hasn't been fully formed, but you put it out there, and that actually generates a lot of discussion. And in many cases, I've found when I put that idea out, I actually, people write in saying, "Oh yeah, there's this paper in Ethiopia that we did this, and here's a way to go about it." It's actually a way of getting feedback even before you write the paper, and it's perfectly reasonable. I mean, lots of bloggers do that. And then the other important aspect of the how to blog is the engagement on the comments and the exchanges with the readership. I mean, to me, that was the most satisfying aspect. First, because you get comments that you don't normally get in an academic seminar or even a GDN conference or whatever, which is, I still remember I wrote something on child mortality, the effect of the global financial crisis on child mortality. And this woman writes in saying, I don't know any economics, but I just gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. And the thought that these babies are dying before the age of 1 is so difficult for me to fathom that I am determined to do something about this. That's the kind of engagement. And these are people that I wouldn't normally meet or encounter, but they get involved and they get engaged in a way that's both important but also satisfying. And then, of course, all sorts of people, all sorts of people think they know you. I used to run into people at the airport, and they start talking. They go, "Hi, Shanta," and then they start talking to me, and then I say, "Well, by the way, have we met before?" And they go, "No, I just read your blog." It's almost like they know me, even though I didn't know them. I should say also, and then just one more thing on the engagement, I would say is this, as I mentioned, that's this thing with Devesh Kapoor, but even with harsher critics, including people who criticize a post of mine, and I give you a couple of examples. I invite them to post on my blog, and then we engage in a debate on the platform. There was a guy named Patrick Bond from South Africa who was a long-standing critic of the World Bank and structural adjustment and everything else. And I wrote something about extractive industries that he just took off at me. So I invited him to write on the blog. Then I wrote a response. He wrote a response back, and then I wrote a response back. In fact, I call that second post Patrick versus Shanta round 2. It was like a boxing match. And people really liked it because I mean, some people think that said that, Patrick has been saying all these things without anyone really taking him on. But also, I think people would say that I've been getting away with things that people haven't been criticizing me enough for. Then I remember I wrote this other post on quiet corruption that got the head of Oxfam, Barbara Stocking, really angry. I later found out the reason is that they were trying to raise a lot of money from the British government. And when I was saying things like teachers are absent and doctors are absent from clinics, that didn't help their case. But nevertheless, I invited her to I got her, she wrote me a letter, and I said, can I post your letter on my blog and then write my response? And she said yes. And so I did it. And actually that generated a huge commentary around Oxfam itself, nothing to do with my blog, but people were taking on Oxfam as part of that. Then finally, I would say, again, seeing on the how, that we think of a blog as a piece of writing, it's 800 to 1,000 words, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a podcast. It could be an interview. It could be a video. All of these are means of communication. And I see now with my students, I think they listen to podcasts more than they read. And in fact, when I first started trying out a podcast or an interview or a video clip on my blog, the number of hits just shot up. There's so many, and I realized it was mostly the younger generation. But anyway, whatever it is, you get your message across. And I remember I wrote this. I wrote a paper. In fact, I published it. But I also gave a speech at a conference on Africa's statistical tragedy. Some of you may have seen the paper. And that speech, and the conference people sent me the clip from my speech. So I just posted that on my blog. And people really got into it, and so much so that they would write to me saying, oh yeah, then I played it in my class to my students, and they can use it in other domains. Then one other thing that probably is on your minds, and what people often ask me, is how do you find time for this? Now, keep in mind, as I said, this is part of my job. So I don't see this as sort of an additional thing I do with my job. I think this is part of the job. But the other thing you should keep in mind is you really want to restrict the amount of time for a blog. So my rule of thumb is I spend no more than 40 minutes in writing a blog post. And that's a discipline I try to get. First of all, I don't have more than 40 minutes in a day because of all the other things I'm doing. But the other point is you don't try to perfect it. It's not something that you write and then you revise and re-revise and edit and is Ramesh there? Is Ramesh Vaidyanathan there? There. Okay. Well, yeah. So, you don't want to harass him too much. I would say, first of all, it has to be your authentic voice. So it isn't, and it doesn't have to be letter perfect. And in fact, when I was going back and reviewing some of my old blogs, I realized, I could have said this differently, better, but that's okay. The important thing is to get it out. And timing is important because sometimes the issue is breaking, and then like the global financial crisis or things in Gaza now, that you want the post to come out, and it doesn't have to be letter perfect. and you don't over revise. And it's the same thing with guest bloggers. Somebody, when somebody sends me a blog post for my blog, I make sure it's coherent and it reads well and it makes the point well. But I don't try to perfect it, because I want their voice, not my voice, to be the one on the blog. One of the other functions of a blog is to amplify other people's ideas. I mean, one of the things I found is that many of my colleagues at the World Bank, particularly the sort of high-flying researchers, have very interesting papers that have really interesting policy implications, but they're buried in paragraph 3 of section 4 in the paper. And I see these papers. I used to be their boss, so I had to see them, and I would say, okay, I'm just going to write a blog post just about paragraph 3 in section 4. Forget about all the identification strategy and all of that other stuff. This is the important result. This is the important insight. Let's get this out as quick as possible. Finally, I just want to say and as you may have guessed, I'm very enthusiastic about it, because it is, even though I see it as part of my job and part of my mission, it's also very satisfying. Just the ability to engage with these people, and I like to think be able to influence their thinking. Also getting other people to blog. I mean, I said I was the first blogger at the bank. There are now about 150 blogs, and I tried to use my position. I mean, I was already a chief economist at the time, so I was in a fairly high position. I mean, they couldn't fire me, or not easily, at least. But I wanted to create the space so that young people would blog. And I think young people sort of took to it much more quickly. I remember visiting a friend of mine who's about my age, who was then the Secretary General in the Ministry of Finance of Senegal in Dakar. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Yeah, I just, I have this blog and I've been really enjoying it." And he goes, "What's a blog? What do you do? How do you do this?" And everything else. I explained to him what I was doing. And then he goes, "Do you want to come down and meet my staff?" And I go, "Sure." And I go downstairs to his staff and he introduces me and they say, "Oh yeah, I read your blog. I read your blog." The staff all knew about my blog, but the boss had no idea what a blog was. Then a couple of other advantages. I was thinking about the benefits of all of this. There's now empirical evidence that blogging increases the downloads on research papers. So people who blog about their research papers have systematically higher numbers of hits compared to those who don't. So it is also a way of publicizing your research papers as you go. And then finally, I would say that the IT department of the World Bank asked me if I wanted to see the institutions that were were reading my blog. By the way, the readership is I think I calculated it's about 1,000 times. The number of people who have read my blogs is 1,000 times the total number of people who have ever read any of my published research papers, right? Wow. So it's 3 orders of magnitude higher in terms of coverage. But then, so I thought, great. So I'll find out who these people are. And, there was the usual think tanks, academic institutions, government offices that were the main readers. But number 4, believe it or not, were people in prisons. And number 5 were people in mental institutions. So I have no idea what they were getting out of my blog, but whatever it was, that was the readership. That's a message that you might want to keep in mind if you undertake your blog. It varies with the topic. say this piece on child mortality, I was thinking about, or the thing about our African women having too many babies, I was thinking about African women or African couples, families, around the world. And so then you try to write it in such a way that it's accessible to them rather than to the specialist audience. You don't succeed fully. I mean, I can't help myself sometimes. But then sometimes the blog, some of my blogs are ad hominem, if you like. I was responding, or I'm critiquing, or I'm questioning a comment made by somebody else. Actually, this is on the web. All of this is on the web now. I engage in a fairly vigorous discussion with my boss at that time, Justin Lin, who was the chief economist of the World Bank, about industrial policy. And by the way, he's also a member of the board of GDN. But we disagreed on the relevance of basically it was the relevance of the Chinese industrial policy for Africa. I was the chief economist of Africa at the time. So I wrote some pieces criticizing what he said. He wrote some pieces back defending it, and then we went back and forth. And by the way, this actually, and those were like I was engaging in a debate. This was important because in a lot of cases, I remember then going to Ethiopia and giving some lectures at the university, and they had seen this stuff, and they said, "I can't believe he's your boss." We're not used to taking on our boss in public, but that's what's important. We still have a very good personal relationship and even a professional relationship, but that's okay. As professional economists, we can disagree, and we let the world learn from our disagreements. I'd say it's what I said earlier, which is think of it as a conversation. I like to think that even if I wrote boring World Bank documents, I used to give interesting speeches, or I would have interesting conversations over lunch with people. And I go back to that, sort of say, what would I say if this were a conversation? And also because the point of that is to engage. I mean, when you're in a conversation, you don't give a speech. You're letting people interrupt you or say things back and forth. And that's the way you think about a blog post. So this is a very important question. See, when I told you about the reason I wrote the blog, I started the blog, the policymaker was not my direct intended audience. And frequently, they themselves didn't read it. As I told you, this guy in Senegal had never even heard of a blog, even though his staff had. And that's the point. I get to people, the blog gets to people who themselves then inform the policymaker. And let me give you another example, which is even more interesting. We did all this work when I was in the Middle East and North Africa region. We did this work on cronyism in Tunisia, crony capitalism, about the elite capture of the Ben Ali family and everything else. Lots of very careful research. And we wrote a report, and I was a chief economist, so I used to try to engage the finance minister in a dialogue around this, and he just changed the subject every time I brought it up. Didn't really want to talk about it. What we did was we converted that report, another one of these 120-page World Bank reports, we converted it into a cartoon video and translated it into Tunisian Arabic. And that video just went viral. Went all over Tunisia, in fact, all over the world. And then all of a sudden, and it was very interesting, the finance minister, the next time I met him, said, Shanta, tell me about this cronyism. My kids are talking about it because they've seen this video. I said, well, okay. In fact, I have been telling you about it for the last 6 months, but you haven't reacted. So I don't worry. I don't worry about reaching the policymaker. I mean, it's nice, and some of them do follow it, and read it, and so on. But these guys are big shots, and they also have the option of, like the finance minister, of not listening to me, but they have to listen to their kids, and they have to listen to their voters, and that's whom I am trying to reach.